Olá, eu sou Teresa Vernaglia, CEO da BRK Ambiental e porta-voz do ODS 6, Água limpa e saneamento, um dos 17 Objetivos de Desenvolvimento Sustentável estabelecidos pela ONU. Sejam todos muito bem-vindos e muito bem-vindas a mais um episódio do Ciclo ESG Saneamento em Pauta. No Brasil, cerca de 5% dos municípios, cerca de 15% da população brasileira são atendidos por empresas do setor privado de saneamento, que, por sua vez, respondem por mais de 20% de todo o investimento realizado no setor. O novo marco de saneamento aprovado em 2020 irá viabilizar uma maior participação do setor privado, que, desde então, somente com os leilões da região metropolitana de Maceió, no estado de Alagoas, e o da SEDAI, a empresa de saneamento do Rio de Janeiro, já somaram mais de 20 bilhões de reais em outorgas e 35 bilhões de reais em investimentos para universalizar o serviço de água e esgoto nos próximos 15 anos. Estes novos investimentos precisam, portanto, estar alinhados às diretrizes ESG e contribuir dessa forma com as comunidades locais, gerando empregos, levando serviços de qualidade, contribuindo com a saúde e a educação da população atendida, além, por óbvio, dos impactos positivos no meio ambiente. E para aprofundar o debate em financiamento sustentável, eu tenho a honra de receber o Paul Clements-Hunt. Paul é bacharel em economia pela Universidade of East Anglia e lidera, nos últimos 9 anos, o Blended Capital Group. Ele iniciou sua carreira em negócios ambientais em 1991 e foi notabilizado pelo seu brilhante trabalho como chefe da iniciativa financeira do Programa das Nações Unidas para o Meio Ambiente, o Ep.5, que é um braço da ONU criado com o objetivo de mobilizar o mercado de investimentos em favor da sustentabilidade, cargo que Paul exerceu por 12 anos e no qual entregou uma relevante base sobre investimento responsável e governança corporativa sustentável. Paul, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. Welcome to the Ciclo ESG Saneamento em Pauta.
Teresa, thank you to BRK Ambiental and all your team, to Carlos and some very good friends there for the opportunity to speak in a informal discussion with you this evening. I'm really greatly looking forward. So hello from Africa, just as it goes dark and you're beginning your day. So delighted to be with you. And Sao Paulo, and particularly the Fig Tree Restaurant, is one of my favorite places in the world. And I spent many happy hours there and in Bovespa. So, it's a delight to be connected to Brazil.
Thank you, Paul. I hope to soon see you here in São Paulo with us.
Sure, yeah.
Paul, in your career, you participated and led movements to arise ESG compliance for business environment. Can you tell us the difference of 10 years ago and what can we expect for the next 10?
Teresa, it's a great question. And let me cast back just a little bit more than 10 years. So we would you believe, we coined, when I was in the United Nations, my team coined the term ESG in 2004. So that's nearly 17 years ago now. So look, when we formulated it, it was really to get a conversation with the investment chain and business beyond ethics, beyond the whole issue of ethics. It was to look at financial materiality, the materiality of environmental, social governance. And when we launched what are now the principles for responsible investment in 2006 for Kofi Annan, we dreamed of having $1 trillion of investment funds backing it, 1 trillion. And I think the day we launched it at the New York Stock Exchange, the PRI, we had 4 trillion and 53 investment institutions, very powerful institutions. And 17 years on, it's now 4,000 institutions and $100 trillion nominally backing ESG. So look, some people say, why did it take so long? I think it's gone quite quickly, and I think it's mainstreamed along the investment chain. But the difference between then, let's say 2006 to 2010 now, is that it has mainstreamed for a range of reasons, both at 100,000 feet and on the ground. We cannot ignore the impact of the global financial crash in 2008-9. That sensitized some of the world's largest pension funds and insurance reserves and sovereign wealth funds to systemic risk. But I think the difference is that people are aware of risk. Once you become aware of risk, you become aware also of new opportunities, of the new industries, of the new way of approaching things. That's the upside of the story, which is really what we always wanted with ESG. We wanted people to think of risk, but also to open their eyes to new industrial and business opportunities. The last point for your first question for me is that if we project ahead 10 years, we see this tremendous interest in ESG, but there is greenwash. There are people making mistakes, and there are people packaging things which are claiming more than they're actually doing. I think smart companies, and I put BRK Ambiental right at the front of that list, and I'm not saying that because we're speaking today. I've followed your story through Louise Meyer, I think one of your colleagues, and through Carlos and some of your other colleagues for the last 4 or 5 years. It's a smart company, and the way you're doing sustainability is admirable because you're authentic and because your fundamental business is water and sanitation, and you know both the power and benefits of water and also the downside of getting sanitation wrong. So I'll stop there before I run on too much, but it's moved far quicker than I could have imagined. Remember, we hoped for $1 trillion to back it. 17 years on, there's $100 trillion saying we understand we need to align with ESG.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I like when you say if we were born in 2000 and now in 2021, we already passed a lot of risks. So it's interesting your view that we are facing a systemic risks across the years. So, and how relevant is for the companies to really understand how resilience needed to be the business and how ESG is connected with it. So thank you for sharing your view, Paul. And Paul, Brazil is facing a challenge in terms of water scarcity and security. How can you scale up financing for sanitation-related investments? And what is the role of a blended finance for that?
The scale of the water problem in terms of water stress and sanitation side, obviously not just in Brazil, but worldwide. And particularly for the 2 billion people at the base of the economic pyramid, those people in the world's mega cities, whether it's Sao Paulo or whether it's Mexico City or whether it's across in some of the Chinese mega cities. These problems of clean water and sanitation are very real. I honestly feel that in the next few years we will see, again, I use the word, a reimagination of public-private projects. I think we've got to shift the focus from the projects to the people. You can have a wonderfully sculpted and financed project, but if you misread the public in terms of tariffs and the politics and the exploration of land, you result with a social problem, and you know that better than me, I'm sure. So yes, public-private partnerships, but let's add the extra P. So it's people first, public-private partnerships, and different ways of structuring them. It will happen, and I think it will happen because the big investment institutions are really hungry to allocate to infrastructure, and particularly water. They just need the right structures and the right presentation. And I don't think our models yet fully provide that protection.
Do you have a real successful example or examples where this is already happening to share with us?
I was very fortunate. A couple of months back, I was invited to speak to a water and sanitation dialogue in Cairo. virtually, not in person. And it was not just about Egypt. It was about the Maghreb, the Northern Africa, where water stress is obviously a real issue. And what I found fascinating was an example and a presentation, and I know it myself from living in France, where you have a model in France where the focus is not about investment per se in the project. The focus is about investment in the creation of community-owned companies where there is a return for the private entities involved in what is a hybrid vehicle. And these examples have existed in France for 120, 130 years. They're very stable. They generate a return for the private partners who quite often manage the operations and maintenance and the whole infrastructure of the water architecture and the sewage architecture and the sanitation. So these are not structures which flip ownership every few years. These are in some ways deals between the community and public and private entities. And I think that is a really strong model. That's one. But let me press on and give a second one where this is where I'm really excited, and one of the reasons I came to live in Africa, to be close to our some of our investment companies here in East Africa. And it is what we're going to see in the next few years, because of the fusion of technology, because of the reinvention of finance and the reimagining of finance. I think that the whole business of optimizing water infrastructure portfolios by not solely thinking grid, mini grid, but thinking grid, mini grid, off grid, hybrid, distributed infrastructure. Because the reality for many parts of the world, and it's not just the rural and agricultural at the last mile, it's also the last mile in the cities, okay? Big infra is not always going to be the answer. It's going to be a very, very important part of that in terms of water infrastructure, we know. But I think we've got to learn to blend in not just finance, but blend in distributed infrastructure solutions that allow those last mile communities to also accumulate their own infrastructure which delivers basic services. Because the reality is, if we want universal infrastructure coverage, UIC, within this century, the bottom 2 billion quite often are going to wait a long time for big grid solutions, in terms of both rural and in some ways inner city. So the reason I'm using this language was actually in the context of electricity. So we've been doing a lot of work with sovereign wealth funds for the last 5 or 6 years. And each year they have a marvelous dinner somewhere exotic. So Casablanca last year was Juneau in Alaska. Before that, it was Kazakhstan. Before that, it was Auckland. Okay, so the sovereign wealth funds, they like to travel. But sitting next to a gentleman who'd put $10 billion worth of renewable energy, distributed energy, into Morocco, right? And he didn't differentiate in some ways between utilities. There are obviously different challenges, but the idea of technology and distributed infrastructure being mixed in an infrastructure portfolio to deliver basic services. And this is your business, you know much better than I do. But the link that I would make is that we have to package and sell that optimized portfolio, the optimized from grid, the big projects, the mega projects, the distributed. We have to sell that more effectively to institutional investors. The price of infrastructure in the OECD countries it's such a premium that it's too expensive. So I think that educational process for investors, that it doesn't always have to be big, solid infrastructure. It can be big, solid infrastructure with distributed technology brought in, all those different elements. I think that's going to be a challenge in the next 5 or 10 years, but that excites me because I see the difference it makes to, we have about 250,000 clients in the Lake Victoria region, which is very slow in terms of any core infrastructure, whether on the water side or on the electrification side. But what we're seeing is that fusion of technology, digital, pay-go, it allows communities to accumulate their own infrastructure. The reason I left the UN in 2012 was I was convinced that where sustainability hits the road is where infrastructure and equity, that's social justice, meet. We need universal infrastructure coverage. And that's why I genuinely love companies like BRK Ambiental, which think differently. And, I've seen some of the work you've done on sustainability is just marvelous.
The opportunities that we have ahead of us, alternatives in terms of technology to find different ways to serve the communities. And at the end of the day, we also need social license to operate our business. So we need to take care about the community. So thank you, Paul. And Paul, how are the risk disclosure on ESG themes evolving towards a more sustainable finance and responsible investments? Can we foresee a better legal architecture that covers the global business innovation and inherent global risks? I think it's a little bit of what you have mentioned before.
Yeah, look, there's a term in English which is a second-hand car salesman. So I hope I'm not going to, but I'm going to be so optimistic for very specific reasons about that question around legal architecture, ESG risk. And in part, it's what we've seen in literally the last few weeks, okay? So one of our focus areas along the investment chain is not just the investors and the intermediaries and then the investee corporations like BRK Ambiental, but it's the legal world, the accountants and the professional advisors who quite often control very important parts of the investment chain. So for example, just a few months back, we looked at 55 of the world's leading law firms to see what they were doing on ESG, to survey them. And there's an explosion of interest because investors are now really asking for a full scope of ESG exposure. Now, that in itself is good, that's positive. But what we've seen in the last few weeks is a huge uptake in legal decisions, whether it's in the context of, the obvious ones are Shell and Exxon, okay, on the energy side, and the whole issue of climate justice, that you are beginning to see legal precedents put in place which are going to drive the argument around the systemic risks that I was talking about. Now, if a court in Holland can judge that Shell needs to reduce its pollution for future generations, tell me, as the CEO of a water and sanitation company, what is going to stop courts looking in the not too distant future at the government's responsibility to deliver clean water for future generations, right? So we're beginning to see a very, in some ways, complex and difficult set of legal calculations are beginning to arise and are beginning to affect systemic risk, right? So again, if you look at the last few weeks, there's all sorts of risks out there. The Deliveroo IPO in London, right? They reckon was the least successful IPO in history, or the biggest failure, because it's something like 28 was knocked off the given price on day one. That was because of social risk. The biggest investors stepped away from it because they didn't like their labor model. That's one example. If you look, we've mentioned, Exxon, and we've mentioned Shell, but there are many different examples in there in terms of that combination, whether it's environmental or social risk or governance risks. Look at what's happening in the consulting world, and it's changing the legal architecture. McKinsey's just paid 400 million, not accepting any liability, but to buy their way out of the US opioids painkiller scandal in terms of some of their advice. Ernst & Young in Germany, and these are governance issues, again, is because of Wirecard and the failure there, has real problems. Now, I might seem to have come a long way from water, but everything that I'm talking about is ESG related. It's either environmental, it's either social, or it's governance. So I think the lens is good. So before I run off into the legal world, my key point there is that, and to answer your question, we're beginning to, we've had our different crises, global financial crash, the COVID pandemic, different other issues coming to the fore, water stress, water security, impact on corporate operations, all those different things. We're now beginning to see the biggest courts in the land and the biggest legal thinkers say, wait a minute, if you can't protect a basic right, or you can't deliver a basic service to future generations, well, at what point does that move from negligence to criminal negligence to right at the far end to ecocide? So, without I guess, unduly scaring corporate leaders or capital markets, the legal wind has changed and is changing in courts. We see with the Biden administration, you see in Europe. I'm not so aware of what's happening in Brazil, but have followed for many years the issues in and around deforestation in the Amazon. So my final point there is the legal wind has shifted. And what 10 years ago would have been, it's not an issue, they're not front and center, but the legal world is moving. And what we know is every law company that we looked at, we reckon that the legal industry were very late. They only started waking to ESG, with few exceptions, in 2018. And they're now racing to put ESG partners on. They're repurposing lawyers. And I'm not overstating it. It's a massive ESG talent war in the legal sector. So, Teresa, I hope that at least touched some of the key points of your question without going too far away from it.
Yeah, it was crystal clear, Paul. Thank you very much. And so we are finalizing our conversation, unfortunately. And Paul, I would like to ask you to leave us your final message and your expectation for the inclusion of issues related to water in the private sector. Let's give us a little message.
Fundamentally, it's a message of hope born of an extremely challenging reality, which is, I think the hope side of it is what we've discussed, and not repeating it too much. It's a fusion of technology, our ability to reimagine finance, our ability to be far more effective in distributing and delivering basic services if we want to. I would go as far as saying that, climate change dominates so much in the conversation at the moment, because it's almost like the horror movie you don't want to watch, but you have to, right? But at the same time, climate can be often quite removed from ordinary people. It affects ordinary people, it affects communities on the ground, but it's so difficult to get hold of. I think water, and obviously connected to climate issues, whether on the flood side or the drought side or the water security side, I would hazard a guess that within a decade, water will be absolutely the dominant issue in terms of our cities, communities. We see it now with the oceans. We're starting with the oceans. We're waking up to the influence of microplastics and all of those problems and, infestation of the oceans. And I think you go back to the early 70s, from the Club of Rome, when they started looking at finite resources and the worries for humanity, and even before that to Malthus, right? Water's always been there, but I think human beings have taken it for granted unless you experience water stress. And I think we will see that change in the next decade, 10 years, 15 years. So for companies like yours, I would say, your social purpose is almost set for you. because your mission is so important to get right, right? I guess the regulatory burden is quite high and quite heavy. As water problems proliferate, I'm sure that the politicians will pass on lovely new regulations to water and sanitation companies. And that means that you have to hire the brightest, the best, retain them. You absolutely have to be embedded in science, and you are anyway, and technology. But I think your most wonderful thing, if you get it right, and I believe BRK Ambiental is getting it right and is quite ahead of a lot of other water companies I see, is that if you have the radar screen provided by sustainability, by ESG and the SDGs, you will see the risks, you'll see the social risks, you see the environmental risks, but my word, you will see the opportunities. And it's changing the culture and the way of thinking. And Teresa, as a CEO, you know that is both the hardest thing to do and the most important. Changing the culture, and I can feel that the BRK Ambiental journey is accelerating in a wonderful way because of your leadership, because of the team. And I don't want to sound like a second-hand car salesman. I genuinely followed the BRK Ambiental story from before it was BRK Ambiental, when it was in the Odenbrecht group. And I think what has happened with the company and the change of the culture and the way you think is just a marvelous example. So I will stop there. But again, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you and your colleagues. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Paul. It's also a pleasure to talk with you and learning with you. So thank you very much for your time. Muito obrigada por essa conversa. Eu gostaria também de agradecer a todos e a todas que nos acompanharam até aqui. Infelizmente, a gente já vai encerrando essa conversa e espero vê-los todos no nosso próximo episódio do Ciclo ESG Saneamento em Pauta. Muito obrigada a todas, muito obrigada a todos.